Was used to see Pavel around, and his computer reads my key. This one does not read the key, so when Pavel will come, hopefully we'll have slides, but if in the meanwhile I'll read my text. So in the two previous conferences I've tried to outline a difference between a sociology which is built from a conception of society which is top-down, as opposed to a sociology which conceives of society as a construction that we have to see bottom-up from what I call the ordinary people or ordinary citizens, in the case I'm going to speak about today. So this is the third conference, which should be a case study of the way we tackle sociological problems from a bottom-up point of view, which is, in this case, it's on democracy and on politics, and I'll try to stress what the point of view of the ordinary citizen can be. So this is the general frame of my talk. So it's usually taken for granted nowadays that politics only exists within the limits of what has become, in the 20th century, the major framework allowing for the expression of politics, the nation state. This framework leads to apprehend societies as stable entities defined by established borders, bringing together individuals who are assumed to abide by the same legal order and share the same value system. This monolithic view of society goes hand in hand with a narrow conception of politics, which is reduced to problems concerning the conquest and exercise of power. In an analytical perspective, which is my perspective, this monolithic view of society and this narrow conception of politics have to be dispensed with and superseded by a dynamic and reflexive conception which would account for the practices societies and politics are made of. Societies and politics are made of practices, so the level of bottom-up construction is here. What are the practices which make up a society and which make up what we call politics? I would like to substantiate this proposition by showing what kind of methodological changes such a practical term implies for sociological work. And the very first point is to look at what I call the consequences of pluralism in relation to society and to politics. So pluralism. Sociology and anthropology have taught us that any society is a composite entity, structurally divided and constantly experiencing multiple tensions between social classes, peer groups, ethnic affiliations, generations, traditions, religions, residential areas, regional disparities, languages. So multiple tensions. From a pluralistic point of view, the perpetuation of any large society depends on a collective commitment to establish tacitly or explicitly a steady state of equilibrium between all these centrifugal forces. Even though this equilibrium is provisional and always threatening to break down. In other words, the state's monopoly of physical violence, which is the motto of Max Weber, is never enough to maintain the unity of a society and ensure that it will not be called into question by separatist movements. One can assume that the permanence of a nation-state depends on what I call a political work. I call this the political work that any society has to carry out to preserve its existence. When I say any society, it's the citizens or individuals living in a society have to carry out a political work to preserve and maintain the existence of a state, of an entity, of a political entity. This political work is protean, continuous, diffuse, and institutionalized at the same time. It is performed on a daily basis in the multitude of what Sally Falkmore, an anthropologist in law, calls sites of reglamentations. There is a multitude in a society, sites of reglamentations, in which collective life is organized and unfolds. All societies and all types of political regimes require and feed a political work of this kind. This work, this political work, which a society performs on itself, aims at solving as satisfactorily as possible the conflicts that regularly emerge in the process of social change, as well as it helps reproducing the legitimacy bestowed on the temporary holders of power. When one admits that a multiplicity of levels of legality operates simultaneously in a society, which means, and that's important, which means that the state is only one of these levels. The state is only one of these levels of legality. One can draw a conclusion. Each of the members of a society has to comply with the norms of both a general and local normative orders. You have a general normative orders, typically law and police justice, which is a general normative orders, but a multitude of local normative orders too. This pluralist conception of politics, which somehow gives an analytical content to what Tocqueville called intermediary institutions, can be recapitulated in three propositions. Here I'm so sorry there's no slides because it's easier when you say you have three propositions, so I see them, but I'll have to just talk. The first proposition is that the organization of societies always predates the theories which claim to give a theory to a society. Societies exist before we just imagine what they are. They just exist before we think of them. This proposal helps discarding all tentative descriptions of ideal forms of government and all abstract definitions of the principles on which a political order should be set up to be called democratic. Second proposition, the mere fact of living in a given state endows an individual with a practical knowledge about the political order in which he finds himself. This is what can be noticed when one observes how ordinary people formulate practical judgments on the ways a government exercises power, on the political affairs they are concerned with, judgment on the political affairs they are concerned with, and judgments on the competence or reliability of those who are in charge, politicians. Third proposition, a collective action can be called political only when it is defined as such by those who engage in it. There are many collective actions, but a few of them can be called political. All collective actions are not of political nature. To be acknowledged as such, it must meet an action, a collective action must meet three requirements. Being ostensibly organized around an acceptable political aim. 2. Defining a public cause to fight for or an adversary to oppose. And 3. Assessing the accuracy of the mobilization by scrutinizing the signs of its success. These three requirements can be summed up in a statement. The public life of the society perpetually and simultaneously develops on two levels, which do not necessarily move on at the same rhythm. So the first domain is a domain of the political, and the other domain is politics. I'll explain. Since the ancient Greeks, these two levels are duly acknowledged. Politics is a sphere of practical activity, the aim of which is the establishment and continuous adjustment of the constitutional framework of a state and the functioning of the organs of government, representation and participation. This is politics, which is now called the professional side of politics. The domain of the political refers to the practical activity, the purpose of which is to set up an acceptable order of social relations between citizens of a political entity. So, politics on one side and the domain of the political on the other side. Somehow, one can assume that the domain of the political is a melting pot, in which the practices of politics are forged. By practices of politics, I mean what I said before. This is all the professional side of politics. So these are called, I call them practices of politics. So the domain of the political, that is the organization of social order between citizens, irrelevant of professional politics. So the domain of the political is the melting pot in which the practices of politics are forged and constantly reshuffled. That's why government change ideas sometimes, because society has changed, so politics must change too. But society has changed before politics has changed. This is precisely why these practices of government sometimes are involved in the creation of new institutions to guarantee the citizens' rights, freedoms and security, and the enforcement of the legal means by which warrant that these institutions fulfill the duties assigned to them. But to avoid any misunderstanding, I need to just say some prefatory methodological words about one question, which is, what is a political phenomenon? It's very good, Arthur. In some minutes you'll have the slides. So what is a political the political phenomenon? So there are four main ways to answer this question. The first, thank you. Hey, but can you put the full screen? I don't remember. Oh, F5. So this is yesterday. No, it's not a good one. I'm sorry. This is an old one. This is the one which was no, because in okay. you I got this. Because I added in the new file. This is the file which was here yesterday. No, but I changed the file. So the conference of today, I need Pavel. Okay. So the political phenomenon. So four main ways to answer the question of what is the political phenomenon. The first can be called essentialist. In this way, politics reduces itself to the legitimate struggle to get control of the administration of the state and to the ways public policies are decided and implemented. So this is an essentialist position on the political phenomenon. A second way to consider the phenomenon, the political phenomenon, may be called absolutists. I swear it's not. Oh yeah, that's it. It's great. Okay. So here we are, essentialist, absolutist. Thank you. So, in this view, Politics encompasses any human affair, and the public policies which are devised always reflect the state of the power or domination relationship which are specific to a given society, which usually triggers the protests of those who are subjected to such unjust or unequal treatment. This absolutist view is summarized by a well-known motto which says everything is political. This is absolutist. Everything in society is political. But as I said, not all collective actions are political. The third way could be called institutional. Politics is then totally enclosed in the sphere of activity which people engage in when they are busy working in government agencies, state administrations, organs of opinion shaping, this is media, or in association or in activist groups. Analysts frequently mistake this sphere of activity for politics. They mistake this sphere of activity for politics. And when you speak about politics in the media, you always speak of this domain of activity, never of what's going on in society at large, which I call the domain of the political, which is, in my view, political too. So these three conceptions of politics bestow an identical primacy upon the state and reckon that the key element of politics is a takeover of the crucial sites which are said to be the seat of power, that is government, parliament, justice, the military, the police, and other official duties. In this perspective, politics amounts to either working directly within the machinery of government, or partaking in the process of decision-making, or working as an opposition to those who momentarily are in charge of the executive. So these are the three main domains of activity. Working in the machinery of government, or working as an opposition, and partaking in the process of decision-making. Why these domains are larger than just the people sitting in the government? Because politics, as a professional activity, enrolls many people, and you can't just say it's these people sitting in the government who do that. As I've contended earlier, a pluralist conception of politics exists, which articulates three proposals. You see them? The order of politics is scattered. The order of politics, which is not the practices of politics. The order, which is larger for me. The order of politics is scattered throughout society. The institutionalization of politics takes place in a multitude of ways which are not confined to those acknowledged by state administration. And forms of political action manifest themselves under modes that often go far beyond the usual bounds set by official politics. So I suggest to go a step further with this conception and assume that this pluralistic outlook has to be supplemented by a practical conception of the citizen's role in politics. I claim that citizens master and make use of an ordinary conception of politics to criticize the government and the ruling elites and bring about unexpected social and political changes. Now I need to explain that the conception of the citizen I accept, I admit. Being a citizen is just one dimension of the everyday life of an individual. And you're so many things beside being a citizen. You're not just a citizen. But a citizen is a role you come to play every time you act as a member of a political entity. When you are asked, for example, to go to vote. So then at that time you're a citizen, or when you're asked to go to war by a government. So at that time you are a citizen. But in many other occasions you do not act as a citizen, you act as a normal human being. So we have to keep in mind that being a citizen is just one dimension of your life, which is, and it has it's quite of interest and importance. So being a citizen is a role you play every time you act as a member of the political entity to which you are said to belong to. The question so the question now is, how do these changes which emerge at the grassroots level of political work, that is, in society, in between people, speaking in the streets, in shops, in wherever, political questions emerge in society. So the question is, how do those changes that a society wants to see about emerge at the grassroots levels of political work turn out to be legal regulations? When does the will of people to see things change in a society turn out to be laws? So this leads us to another question. Understand, what does a government do in a pluralist perspective? Here again I turn back to sociology and anthropology. So studies in sociology and social anthropology, I've made it clear that the creation and the perpetuation of a society are invariably accompanied by the institutionalization of a governing body in which responsibility for collective matters, to which responsibility for collective matters is delegated. This body fulfills two groups of functions: allowing for cooperation between individuals by enforcing a single compelling codification of citizens' rights and duties, which means you just have to keep in mind the definition of the citizen as a role, as one dimension of your life. This compelling codification is not compelling on all aspects of your life. It's a codification of what you are compelled to do as a citizen, as and only as a citizen. And the other group of functions is to secure peace and stability, to entrench the unity of a human community. The degree to which a government extends its grasp on public life is commensurate with the legitimacy it manages to acquire. In the case of a democratic regime, the charges which are delegated to a government and its departments cover large parts of citizens' daily life: education, health, justice, family, employment, housing. This is true in our democratic regimes in Europe. I suppose it's the same here. So the government has a part in education, health, justice, family, employment, housing. In advanced democracies, such a delegation occurs in a dynamic process in which a question of private interest eventually obtains the status of a question of general interest, prompting state intervention. Note that the public policies that are handed over to a government never last forever. Matters that are subjected to public action one day, maybe sovereignty, security, economy, or well-being, these matters may stop to be so another day. Governments never deal with all these matters except when they are asked to do so, or accepted to do so. I speak about democratic regime. Hence, one dimension of the political work a society performs consists in setting the content and extent of the scope of state intervention. So my claim is that what goes on in society is reflected by the number of departments a government is allowed to deal with. Here again, I stress the importance of the role of citizenship in the definition of the extent and scope of state intervention. The dynamic conception, yeah, this is the slide. This is the slide. The dynamic conception of government as product of a relentless political work suggests that the power the leaders are endowed with is never absolute. Never absolute, and I take this true even for authoritarian regimes. They constantly, the leaders constantly act under citizens' scrutiny who exercise their control over the ways the administration of public affairs should be conducted through all kinds of means. The political means used by citizens to control the government are extensive. This is a point I like very much. They range from voting to indifference. Indifference is a political position of a citizen. They range from voting to indifference, including militancy in political parties, affiliations to union, abstention in election, violent protests, antisocial behaviors, riots, opinion polls, rumors, slander, sarcasm, and irony. Irony is a very strong political meme. We know that in a democracy, the electoral procedure appears to be the most symbolic dimension of political work, since the vote synthesizes, in a very basic way, a given state of the dynamic of politics. You know, right, left, you vote, you know how many are right, how many are left. But one has to remember that election is not the only arena in which political work is carried out. Multiple sites for the production and testing of new rules for the organization of social relations have gradually emerged with the advances made in advanced democratic regimes. So multiple sites for the production of testing of new rules have been organized. That is, like negotiation between unions, employers, and government, which is a site for regulation, which is quite outside the government strictly sensu. Participating and participatory and deliberative procedures, when you just try to reach citizens and discuss what the government should do in such and such matter. Initiatives to elicit public concern around specific themes. Mobilization calling for the commitment of a population group. Political work operates in all these minute and slow evolutions that go unnoticed, but do quietly shape citizens' attitude and customs, and eventually lead to new claims for rights and entitlements in terms of social welfare, working conditions, environment, women's equality, homosexuality, etc. So all these claims, they just grow bit by bit within society as they turn to be, before turning to be laws, when they turn to be laws. To sum up, though claims for the enhancement of common welfare emerge and are primarily voiced within the domain of the political, this is always society at grassroots level, they must necessarily be handed over to politics from the domain of the political. They must be handed over to politics to become general regulations or laws. As Max Weber wrote, I think there's, oh, I skipped Max Weber. Okay. Sorry for Max Weber. As Max Weber wrote, the state is the institution devoted to do this. The state is the institution devoted to turn a demand from society into a law, a general law, giving legitimacy to the claim. But this institutional arrangement must not lead to overlook a phenomenon. The forms taken by the practices and the contents of politics are forged within the ceaseless back and forth between the domain of the political, society at large, and politics. Authoritarian as well as democratic governments often think they can stop this hidden but relentless political work, this hidden and political back and forth, which vitalizes societies. But history shows that however strong and lasting the efforts of a ruling power to hinder social change, these efforts are doomed to fail in the long run. And if this is so, it is just because the domain of the political society at large ties in with social change. It's social change is one with society. Social change is society. Society is social change. There's no society without social change. This calls for a further elaboration on the notion of citizenship. And to do this, I will rely on my friend John Dewey, which is an American philosopher, pragmatist. And the chapter is Citizenship as a Community of Inquirers. And a famous book by John Dewey is called The Public and Its Problems. Dewey provides a political conception of association. Remember, the first point in my first talk was association. So, and Durkheim provided a sociological conception of association, and Dewey provides a political conception of association. As Durkheim, he contends that the fact of association, by the way, it comes in a later slate, The Public and Its Problem has been written and published in 1927. 1927. Durkheim's book is 1913 on the elementary forms of religion. But so, as Durkheim, Dewey contends that the fact of association does not in itself constitute a society. But contrary to Durkheim, it does not resort to the notion of collective representations to account for the constitution of society. Whereas Durkheim thought collective representations are put by society in the head of the people, Dewey, and this is why it's a political conception, thinks it's the work of the people who constitute society. For Durkheim, the constitution of society requires, I don't know if I've got the slides. No, this is a little bit later. So for Durkheim, for Dewey, the constitution of society requires the perceived consequences of a. This is the sentence by a quotation by Dewey. The perceived consequences of a joint activity and the distinctive role of each element that produces it. This perception creates a common interest, that is to say, a concern on the part of each for joint action and the contribution of each member who engaged in it. In other words, the passage from association, being together, to society requires the actual involvement of all the citizens, of all the members of the group, in the production and sustainment of common interests. According to Dewey, the problem, this is a quotation, the problem of discovering the state is a practical problem for human beings living in association with each other. This is a complex problem. It depends on the power to perceive and recognize the consequences of the behavior of individuals united in groups, and to trace these consequences to their source and origin. So here are the public and its problems, 1927. I didn't put the page, but it's not that important. Dewey claims that this power is exercised in what he calls an inquiry. This is the central notion in political thought by Dewey, inquiry. And he had what is required to direct and conduct a successful social inquiry. Just one word, a social inquiry is, there is a public problem for a society, and people gather to find a solution to the problem together, and they have to inquire. All these people gather to inquire in what is the best solution to the public problem they just perceive they have. So what is required to do a successful social inquiry is a method. What is required is a method that develops itself on the basis of reciprocal relations between observable facts and their results. This is the essence of the method that we propose to follow. And this method, Dewey calls it democracy. It's important to highlight that the term democracy does not refer to a political regime for Dewey, but to an experimental and scientific method of research applied to public problems. Democracy is an experimental and scientific method of research. We have to know the facts, try to analyze the facts, try to give an explanation, to see what consequences our decision will have, and then take a decision. This is inquiry. And democracy is the fact that it's open to us to observe the facts, explain them, analyze them, and decide. And this is called democracy. This is a process of democracy in Dewey's words. Dewey puts an emphasis on the implementation of the method of democracy, but he is less concerned with the personal qualities that ordinary citizens must possess and display to correctly carry out an inquiry. So he says there's a method, people gather, they inquire, and they find good solutions. But there's no analysis of, do these people, are they able to take these good decisions? So I try to just add something to Dewey. So Dewey's theory rests on what he calls the collective intelligence. No, it's a central notion also which can be discussed. Dewey says there's a collective intelligence, the fact that people gather and all the competences are mixed together, blend. From this reunion comes a collective intelligence which will lead to a good decision. So that's what he called a community of inquirers. So Dewey's theory rests on what he calls the collective intelligence that a community of inquirers demonstrates when it engages in an inquiry prompted by the need to solve a common public problem. Dewey acknowledges that in contemporary societies, this is quite an important point, because we are confronted all the time to this problem now in democracies and other regimes. So Dewey acknowledges that in contemporary societies, collective decisions that citizens should come to take or ratify are about very complex problems. And these problems require a professional and technical knowledge to identify and propose the most satisfactory solution from a scientific point of view. Decisions are quite hard to take, and we don't know whether ordinary citizens can understand even the beginning of the problem. But what Dewey says is the work of identification and proposal is the preserve of experts. Experts can just accumulate the knowledge for a good solution to a public problem. It's not a problem. But what Dewey thinks is that democracy is not overstepped as long as the data collected by these experts is openly and exhaustively made available to anyone concerned by the problem. So the problem is not expertise in itself, it's the fact that the information experts produce are given openly and exhaustively to the public, which, as you know, never happens. So Dewey claims that the ordinary citizens, provided they are duly informed and are given time to deliberate, and as you know, time is not given to citizens to deliberate. Ordinary citizens have the ability to understand this specialized knowledge and take decisions according to rationally expected consequences. Right? Anyone between us is able to understand what an expert is going to say, but provided we give him time to discuss and to study the matter, he will take good decisions. Dewey adds an important comment: as long as secrecy, I recall 1927. 27. As long as secrecy, prejudice, bias, false reports, and propaganda will not be replaced by inquiry and publicization, we have no way of knowing how the actual intelligence of the masses could be fit for assessing public policies. So the method of democracy works as long as a community of inquirers reckons that it is plainly responsible for the decision it takes, which is a condition which is very, very seldom met in our days. Now, I would like to take a larger view on the relationship between citizens and the state, and to do so I will draw some arguments from John Rawls' analysis of the social contract. So the method of democracy was as long as the community of inquirers reckons that it is plainly responsible for the decision it takes. John Rawls. Democracy has radical pluralism. According to John Rawls, citizens' consent to their political institutions is not based on the fact that they all approve of the same conception of the good, but to the fact that they publicly accept that a political conception of justice should govern the basic structures of the society they live in. This is, for philosophers, an important point. Is the good first or justice first? In Rawls' position, we can't have the same conception of the good. This is impossible to reach. There's no way to have one conception of the good. There's as many conceptions of the good as people. But we can have the same conception about justice. What we are allowed to have. Each citizen. For Rawls, the concept of political justice is independent of the concept of good, and it's prior to it. This is why he contends that the function of the social contract is to allow citizens to publicly acknowledge the fact that all their fellow citizens subscribe to the same system of institutionalized constraints. Just remember the notion of role of citizens that I said. It's people have to acknowledge that every citizen does the same in the same political entity. You have to acknowledge, to recognize it's the fact. So for Rawls, this is the function of the social contract. I must recall that for Durkheim, the social contract does not refer to some original foundations of a political community that would warrant a surrender of individual freedom in favor of a leviathan, like in Hobbes. He opposed the position of Hobbes, and he opposed also the position of Locke and Rousseau, which is the collective formulation of common rules to which all agree to abide by on behalf of a higher common good. So Durkheim does not accept neither Hobbes nor Locke and Rousseau. Rawls' conception goes a step further by stating that if the contract allows individuals to become members of a society, it is because it sets the principles of justice that should apply to order the current relationships and solve in a peaceful way the conflicts that would arise in the daily intercourses. These are two, in blue, are two important notions in Rawls' conception. These principles that are set, made public, saying we all agree, because they are public, we can just see that we agree on these principles. So the importance is accepting the principles of justice which order society. But these principles enable people to reach what Rawls calls reasonable disagreements. This is quite important in this theory of democracy. We do not have to agree, but we have to reach reasonable disagreements. Very important point. And overlapping consensus, which actually make up a political society. That is, two principles that open the field for tolerance. In a democracy, you have to accept the differences, but differences shouldn't make war between people. You should just accept them and reach what he calls a reasonable disagreement by overlapping consensus. So we accept the differences. Rawls' conception of the social contract as public acceptance of certain moral principles reverses the prevailing explanation of the social contract. For him, what builds social ties and allows for cooperation is the ordinary knowledge of the fact that correct ways of doing and thinking exist, these correct ways being made public by the principles of justice. Correct ways of doing and thinking exist and can be taken as collectively shared. They are collectively shared insofar as they are public. If you say these are the principles according to which we live together, they are made public, they are not in the head. And the social contract, its function is to make public the principles we adhere to. In short, the social contract reflects the grassroots consensus established and reproduced by the members of a society in their daily lives, rather than being the product of a rational agreement reached through a public debate or theoretical debate. Provided that a democratic society has to guarantee the equal value of all forms of instituted morality, plural instituted morality is the morals of social groups, the ethics, the rules according to which small social groups inside society just live by. Provided that a democratic society has to guarantee the equal value of all forms of instituted morality, according to the same principles that we have no one notion of the good. There's no one notion of the good. Pluralism seems to be immanent in the way it organizes social life. In other words, pluralism Author, sorry. I don't know what's okay. This is the end of the talk. I don't know what. Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, this is the pluralist conception. Pluralism then should be conceived of as a fact. Pluralism is a fact rather than a program to be implemented to achieve democracy. Usually the word pluralism is you have a democracy if you have many parties and there's a concurrence between a competition between parties. So this is called democratic pluralism, many parties. And this is what I call a program for democracy. But if you consider pluralism as a fact of life, you have another view, which is the view I try to explain here. According to such a conception, a pluralistic conception, another outlook on politics takes shape, which gives a prominent place to the practices that citizens are implementing in order to discover, while acting in common, the relevance and appropriateness of the principles that should govern the organization of the collective life in a mutually acceptable form, which is these principles of justice that Rawls sets theoretically are claimed that they are in the life, in ordinary life of the people, that you all the time abide by these principles, and you each time in everyday intercourses reproduce the validity of these principles. The pluralist conception of politics affords an escape from ruinous distinction between policy and politics, between the economy, no slide, between policy and politics, between the economic and the social, between political society and civil society, between essence and practice. It recalls that the normative system governing the relationship between members of a society as citizens define at the same time a range of expectations and of principles of reciprocity ordering these relationships. This is the practical foundation upon which politics rests. In such a perspective, politics should never be conceived of as totally detached from the daily life of the members of a society acting as citizens, which reinforces the idea that citizens constantly make use of what I've called an ordinary conception of politics, which endows them with a specific idea of the common good and of the individual rights and liberties that the state should guarantee to them. And that is what regularly happens when people take to the streets and stake a claim for democracy, which is often justified by a rejection of unacceptable limitation to citizens' rights. To illustrate this point, I want to review two case studies I've been working on the last years. This is civil disobedience and the gatherings. So let's start with civil disobedience. Take some water. Two case studies on civil disobedience. The legitimacy of civil disobedience is highly questionable in a democracy. And the rationale for such a suspicion is simple. Openly claiming a right not to abide by a legal law or a regulation, which is allegedly legitimate, is a decision that poses a threat to the principle of democracy, namely majority rule. The strength of this rule, majority rule, is particularly important the stronger a democratic system is entrenched. In a living democracy, civil disobedience can be objected for four reasons. For reasons of justice, as it's written, evading the law is unacceptable in any political regime, especially in democracy. Now, for reasons of legitimacy, when the interests of some individuals cannot prevail over the interest of a community. For reasons of stability, the state must not yield to those who openly challenge it, especially in the streets. And for reasons of efficiency, because refusing to fulfill an obligation is an approach to politics that does not address the roots of domination and inequality. So political parties would say civil disobedience is politically void. It's useless because you just are disobedient, but you do not organize your disobedience towards the huge problems of politics, which is domination and inequality. However, civil disobedience is still resorted to in contemporary democracies. And this is what fueled my interest in the subject. I just realized that in France, which is let's say an advanced democracy, people resorted to civil disobedience. Hence the title of the book I wrote with my colleague Sandra Logier is Why Disobeying Democracy? Why Disobeying Democracy? So why does people disobey democracy, since expressing a disagreement can easily be done in a democracy by joining a political struggle or using of the numerous legal channels that justice affords in a democracy. A first insight is empirical. If citizens make use of civil disobedience, that is what you observe people making use of civil disobedience. Making use, I'll explain later, but making use of civil disobedience is to say publicly, in my name, I will not abide by this law. Put me in jail. This is, in a democracy, an act of civil disobedience. And people did that when I started to study that. So if citizens make use of civil disobedience, is it just because the political circumstances prompt them to do so? This answer is compelling since it demonstrates that ordinary people know when and why resorting to civil disobedience as a form of political action is possible and acceptable. I mean, you cannot use civil disobedience in all circumstances. In other words, ordinary citizens master what I call a political know-how and make a proper use of it in actual circumstances of political life. Which raises a puzzling problem: on what ground can one assert that civil disobedience is a form of political action? As I said before, political parties said civil disobedience is non-political, it's just void, it's insignificant. So, on what ground should a sociologist assert that civil disobedience is a form of political action? The best way to answer this question is to consider the facts. Then first, one must clear up a fairly common semantic confusion. Indeed, the verb to disobey can embrace an entire scope of actions which consist in refusing to comply with a law, with a regulation, with an order, or with a standard. As we say, a child who refuses to eat spinach, it disobeys. No, it doesn't. He refuses to eat spinach. As a consequence, one may name disobedience any type of dissent, resistance, rebellion. But this is wrong, because there are specific political features to an act of civil disobedience. And here are the features, the political features of civil disobedience. To count as civil disobedience a refusal to fulfill a legal or regulatory obligation must meet a series of requirements. What is funny is you can't do anything to be disobedient. Disobedience has rules. So the requirement is the act, the refusal has to be publicly expressed in your own name. I refuse, it's me who refuse. But it's not an action of one solitary individual. It has to be made by several individuals, because if it's just one individual who refuses to abide by a law, well, I might think it's crazy. But if it's many ones, so the legitimacy of the law can be called into question. So it has to be publicly expressed in one's own name, in a collective way, more than one, and specifying how the law, the obligation, violates a civil or a political right, and you have to base your claim on the invocation of a higher principle. It's equality, justice, solidarity, or dignity. And this is not still enough. To act on civil disobedience, you have to do that. You must make sure that your refusal will be sued in court. So that the penalty, you need to have a penalty, because if there's no penalty, the act of civil disobedience is void. So what is important is to be sued in court, and so that the penalty imposed on you would reopen a public debate on the legitimacy of the contested regulation. This is what civil disobedience is historically, as a form of political action. So, the question is, why should a citizen turn to such a demanding and dangerous form of action to voice a grievance, where he can go to a party, to unions, or to courts to say, I refuse to abide by this, or this is not a good solution. So why should people turn to such a demanding and dangerous, because you are sued in court and the penalty comes on you. It's not in general. When you go on strike or demonstrations, seldom you're caught by the police, and you are in a mass of people, so you are protected in a certain way. But in civil disobedience, you must be sued in court to be valid as an action. The two arguments help answering this question. First, let's consider the content of the acts of civil disobedience. So I'm sorry, my field work was in France, so I'll speak about the reasons why people put themselves in civil disobedience in France. Maybe you have examples in Russia, but I was not in Russia at that time. So the first reason to turn to civil disobedience as a form of political action is to enhance the rights of alien residents. This is assisting illegals. It's forbidden to assist illegals. So if you help an illegal by giving him a bottle of water, for example, it's illegal. You can go to jail. So this is a civil disobedience, because it's said all the time you can't help illegal aliens. Or opposing arrests and expulsions of immigrants, illegal immigrants. If you hide somebody in your house, you go to jail in France. Or refusing to denounce illegal aliens. So all these, many people are engaged in enhancing the rights of alien residents. It's not residents, it's illegal aliens who come to France, and people just put themselves in civil disobedience because they believe it's a higher principle to help people in need. The second one is a general claim to extend the political and social rights of citizens. So this should sound a little bit funny, but what happens, and I feel it's happening also in Russia, it's the political and social rights of citizens in our democracies are bit by bit denied in the wake of the debt crisis. I mean, less money, the state puts less money, has less money to invest. So the rights, social and political rights in our democracies are bit by bit denied in the wake of the debt crisis, which prompts governments to reduce equal access of citizens to basic needs like health, education, justice, police, etc. Or they seriously downgrade the quality and universality of the public service. It's transport, post offices, education. Like in Great Britain, the price to go to university rise 10 times. So the poorest portion of the population can't get the children to university. And this is in the name of the debt crisis. So the rights which have been acquired since World War II and what is called the social state or providential state or whatever are now and since the 70s in the wake of the what was called the economic crisis are bit by bit denied a little bit. And people put themselves in civil disobedience when they are civil servants because they refuse to apply rules that would deny these rights to the people. I mean, you can't go to an hospital if you don't have money. You can die in the front of the hospital, but if you don't have money, you haven't the right to come in because you can't pay for your health service. And people would say, come in and you won't pay. This is civil disobedience. So these are the two main reasons people put themselves in civil disobedience according to a higher principle. The first principle is you have to help people in need, no matter they are illegal aliens. And the other one is you have to save political and social rights of citizens. Now the second argument touches on the nature of the acts of civil disobedience themselves. Acts of civil disobedience are deliberately non-violent and submit the legitimacy of the claim to the public judgment. As I said, you have to be sued in court to reopen a public debate about a law. But if the public says, no, you're wrong, in general, people acting on a civil disobedience basis would say, okay, you don't accept, you don't accept. They won't make a revolution or riots for the right. It's non-violent in principle. And it's, in general, people producing acts of civil disobedience would accept the verdict of the public. But they think their claim is just, and the public will accept that their claim is just, because it's based on a higher principle that anyone should accept. So moreover, the claims and civil disobedience are always motivated by a demand for increased individual rights and liberties. It's never from myself, for my own interest, that I put myself in civil disobedience. It's because I demand an increased right for anyone. So these two reasons give a kind of legitimacy to civil disobedience, non-violence, and the motives, which are in general based on higher principles. So, in sum, and to finish with civil disobedience, I don't see why someone would see in civil disobedience an act which threatens or destroys democracy. And in the book we wrote, we said it's quite the opposite. Since the acts of civil disobedience aim at giving higher principle their full actuality, one can contend that civil disobedience is essential to democracy. And when it's resorted to, it serves to revitalize democracy when it is a little bit weak. Okay, so this is the first illustration, empirical illustration of what is the ordinary conception of politics citizens make use of in their political activities as citizens. Now the other fieldwork or analysis I've made was gatherings, what I call gatherings, and I'll just explain right now, and explain the political nature of gatherings, because gatherings is people occupying city squares in general. Just as civil disobedience, they have been said, or it has been said, that they are non-political. So we wrote with my colleague Альбер Ожьен another book which is called The Principled Democracy, trying to explain why these gatherings are in nature political. The Arab Spring uprisings have unexpectedly led to a global movement of opposition to governments and economic powers, the speed and strength of which have been striking. To the get out that was chanted in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East have echoed the "you are not representing us" in Spain and Greece, or another slogan, "the people demand social justice" in Israel, or "we are 99% in New York and everywhere in the world, and more recently the "we exist" or "don't let Putin enter the Kremlin" in Moscow, or "enough is enough" in Dakar, and lately in Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, Hong Kong, or Ouagadougou, same movements, same slogans, "you are not representing us." This sudden and unpredictable outbreak of claims for democracy has given birth to a new form of political action, which I call gatherings. What is a gathering? It's ordinary citizens taking to the streets on their own, outside of parties, unions, or associations, with no leader, no program, no strategy, and non-violently occupying city squares to ask for a complete change of political order. The international dimension of this movement, of these movements, compares somehow with two of its historical predecessors, the student revolts of May '68 in the Western world, and the occupation of Tiananmen Square in Beijing and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 in the communist world. Some have said that 2011 is the year. 2011 is the gatherings in Tunis, and the ousting of Ben Ali, and the ousting of Mubarak in Egypt. It's in January and February 2011. So some say that 2011 is the year in which the democratic wave has hit the Arab world. Some say that the riots in Tehran in June 2009 have been a forerunner to this movement, but anyway. Gatherings are an innovative political form of action which, like civil disobedience or riots, arises outside traditional ways of expressing political grievances. It is through opposition. Usually it's through opposition parties, trade unions, non-governmental organizations or associations. The first feature of this alternative, in the book we tried to see if it's possible to find common features for all these movements across the world, given that each context is different. So how could you compare New York to Tunis, Rio de Janeiro to Istanbul, or Moscow and Beijing, or Quebec and other places like this? We tried to see if it's possible to find common features to all these gatherings. And here we found 4 common features of these movements. So the first one is that they emanate from crowds of outraged citizens. The only reason people gather is we are outraged citizens. We do not belong to a party, we do not have an ideology, we do not have a leader, we don't know why we want to change, we don't know how, but what unites us is being angry or outraged citizens everywhere. The second feature was the absence of a unified theoretical slogan. No specific reference to class struggle or to the overthrow of imperialism, capitalism, or even to religion. The only demand is for democracy. The slogan was democracy, but under the name of democracy you had a million grievances, a million claims, but always it was under the name of democracy. This is what is striking. The third common feature is that they reject any quest for power. No power. We don't want power. These gatherings do not search power. So, and it's clearly demonstrated by the fact that they claim no leader, no agenda, and no strategy to come to power. There's no demand for power. Hence, the claim that this is non-political and it's useless. These gatherings are useless and non-political because they lack leader, agenda, strategy. Now the fourth feature was that gatherings are scenes where direct democracy, that is, general assemblies, open meetings, no majority vote. This is one interesting point. They refuse majority vote because majority vote evokes what goes on in parties when you have majority and minority. Here, minority has the same right as majority. So no majority rule in these movements, but shared responsibility, equality between each opinion. You have the right to voice your opinion and nobody is going to say to you, this is a wrong opinion. Everybody has the same right to express himself. And shared responsibility, because when you have a gathering, you have to organize a camp, and so you share responsibilities between people on an equal basis. And also another feature which is discovered all over the world is free information through autonomous news networks, because in all these movements, one of the claims is that the media are on the side of the power. Which is quite interesting. Now, as you know, the fifth feature is are often called or promoted through modern means of communication such as Facebook, Twitter, websites, satellite television. I put it as fifth because sometimes people put it first. But sociological studies, political studies on these movements, gatherings, have shown that what we thought was that important, or people thought, or the media thought important, like Facebook, Twitter, this is the way a revolution is done now. Well, these studies demonstrate that it's not enough. It helps a little bit to accelerate mobilization, but in itself, it doesn't make a mobilization. You have to organize it physically. So when one considers the common features of gatherings, these 5 common features that you find in each spot of the world, and you can't say it has been diffused and people said we're going to do the same. It appears as one phenomenon which is shared or taken by all sorts of people, in all sorts of regimes, in all kinds of societies. So one considers the common features of gathering, wherever they took place all around the world. One can contend that they can be regarded as a new form of political action characterized by 2 major attributes. These attributes, in my opinion, reflect a kind of change in the conception or the relationship of citizens toward authorities. So it's the need or the expression of a complete independence vis-à-vis the official channels of political representation. This is one of the attributes, complete independence of citizens vis-à-vis the official channels of political representation. And the second attribute is absolute respect for the equality of individuals and their opinions. These 2 traits, and here is the point, are political in nature. This is opposing the version saying these gatherings are non-political. So, these 2 traits I consider as political in nature because they betray the distant relationship citizens have now established to the authorities and the crave for autonomy they publicly expose in their ordinary as well as political behaviors. These traits express a demand for democracy as form of life rather than democracy as a form of institutional regime. There's a shift. So the notion of form of life comes from my friend Wittgenstein, but what does it mean? It means that beside the fact that democracy can be taken as a constitutional regime with this separation of powers, votes, institutions, you have a demand for democracy as form of life, as a way to be equal, to be autonomous, to live the life you want to live. And this is quite separate from the demand for institutions. So you have what we think is this gathering express or make public the fact that the crave for autonomy of citizens around the world now express a demand for democracy as form of life rather than a form of institutional regime, which means that in an authoritarian regime, the demand for form of life can be also a demand for a change in institutional regime. If you have an authoritarian regime, you can ask for an institution of a democratic regime, but also, and at the same time, as a form of life. In democratic regimes, the demand is just for democracy as form of life and a change in the institutional regime, which is now contested. Say some more on this contestation. So this is the end. It takes just more 10 minutes because it's 2 pages. It comes to the end. And it's called Democracy as an Unreachable Horizon. Gathering demonstrates and remind from time to time, because gatherings, they do not occur all the time. It suddenly explodes and disappears. It lasts at most 1 month. People would stay on the city square for 1 month, but not more. But they demonstrate the fact that people could come to a city square and occupy it and stay there for months, demonstrates and reminds from time to time that to the powerful as well as to the fellow citizens, to ourselves, that citizens are never deprived of their ordinary capacity to judge the actions of those who provisionally, should never forget that it's provisional, those who provisionally govern, and they can resist them. Now the question is, on which ground could ordinary citizens legitimately press a claim for democracy outside the instituted channels devised to this effect? Is it legitimate to voice a grievance, a political grievance, outside of parties, of unions, of associations? Is it legitimate? Is the street the power? So what I call this gathering, I call the extra-institutional political protest movement. This is a sociological notion, funny sociological notion. The extra-institutional political protest movements. They formulate and express a demanding conception of politics. When they emerge in democratic regimes, they operate as a reminder of democracy's essential principles. Namely, they remind that democracy, in its principle, is an open system, the nature of which is to secure an official reckoning of the plural forms of life, making up a society, all the different groups which behave according to their own rules. So the plural forms of life making up a society, and to constantly expand the sphere of individual rights and freedom. This is the highest principle of democracy. Respect for everybody, no imposition of a conception of the good, justice principles, and the fact that it extends individual rights and freedom. These protest movements possess, therefore, a kind of intrinsic legitimacy insofar as no one might oppose the motives which publicly justify them. No one should oppose injustice, inequality, contempt of citizens, abuse of power, arbitrary decisions, disdain for the common good. Disdain for the common good is all matters of environment, when you do not respect what we now call environment obligations. So this, it's very hard publicly to say, I am for inequality, I'm for injustice, I despise citizens, I want to abuse my power. Nobody would, maybe people do that, or governments do that, but they will never say publicly. Moreover, no one can say where democracy should set limits. No one can say where a democracy should set a limit to individual freedoms, and when it's possible to deny new social and political rights to citizens. That is, when citizens ask for a right or for a freedom, you have no rule to say this is not allowed. Because if citizens demand a right, you just have to deal with the problem, because the right is here, and the right is right because it's demanded. And democracy has no limit. You don't know where is the limit for individual rights and freedoms. Democracy, authoritarian regimes can set limits, say this is not allowed. But in democracy, there's no such principle. Another ground of legitimacy in the massive support, another ground of legitimacy of this gathering is the massive support the general population has given to these movements. This is quite astonishing for the powers. People get to city squares, sit there for a month, and the local population is quite happy and supports the movement. So this is impressive. You have 500,000 people in Madrid, and 80%, according to polls, 80% of the population saying they are right to sit there. So a government is usually in a bad position when he reads these polls. So the ground for legitimacy is the support of the general population. And the last ground for legitimacy, which I like, is the concept of democracy itself. The concept of democracy itself gives you good reasons to claim in a legitimate way an extension of rights and liberties. I have 8 categories which you can say are within the concept of democracy. It inheres in the concept of democracy, and it gives you the power to claim democracy. The first one is democracy is a regime in which power should proceed and derive from the people. This is a principle of democracy. So one is a citizen, or a group of citizens, may then assert that it's not the case any longer. I mean, we vote, but you do not represent us because you are so professionalized and we are so far away from what we want you to do. So if it's a regime which power should proceed and derive from the people, you can say it's no longer true, and we want a change in the representative system. Democracy is based on a system of delegation to representatives. So one may claim that the representation doesn't work satisfactorily, which is another point. You have to look at the parliament and see who sits in parliament. And if it corresponds to the structure of society, workers, doctors, media, advocates, entrepreneurs, and what you see in parliament is a representation of the idea you have of your society, you should say this is representative. But if you have 80% of persons belonging to the political sphere. So you could say they work within themselves. They do not represent us because the representation system, the parties, the way candidates are nominated is no longer good. So you have to change the way candidates are elected to these representative positions. And democracy requires equality between citizens. This is a principle. One man, one vote. The democracy requires equality between citizens. And then one may contend that equality is in jeopardy. For example, when, as I said, in the wake of debt crisis, you reduce political rights and social and political rights. You can say, oh, here is a breach in the fact that we are equals. Equality is in jeopardy because we have not the same rights any longer because of money. So this is also a claim for democracy. 4, democracy is based on majority rule. One can then pretend that this rule has noticeably ceased to be valid. What does that mean? It means that when a party is for a very long time in office, they vote what the government wants them to vote, and there's no incidence of what's going on in terms of votes in the parliament, because the government knows that the parliament is going to accept what the government wants to do. So we can say this is not a good system any longer, because majority rule doesn't work. It's just how do you say, a chamber of it accepts what the government says, and there's no public debate in parliament. Which is, in particular in France, what's going on. There's no debate. You have a parliament, but there's no debate. So what's the use of a parliament if you do not debate publicly the problems you have to solve? Then 5, democracy should offer public services to allow for equalization of conditions. That's what I said. And so you can claim democracy saying if you do not allow our children to go to school, democracy is in jeopardy, because the people who are going to vote later would be illiterate, and so, or else probably anyway. So if equalization of conditions is no longer enforced, democracy is in jeopardy. 6, democracy must guarantee individual rights and freedoms. As I said, as nobody knows where one should set a limit on rights and liberties, one can always pretend that a right or freedom is disregarded. So you've got a group of people saying, my rights are disregarded, my rights as a group. And all these 8 categories belong to the concept of democracy, but they have been the basis for claims in the streets. 7, democracy requires impartiality of the state as a condition of justice. So one may then profess that impartiality is grossly violated. In particular, when justice is not independent and depends on government. So you can say democracy is in jeopardy because justice does not make justice. It just does what the government says they have to do. So now, democracy requires a separation of executive, legislative, judicial, and media powers. And then one can proclaim that this separation is no longer effective. And it's particular in the case when an oligarchy owns the media and buys a representative and all the rest, as you know. So you can claim that the separation of powers is no longer, or is massively violated, and does no longer exist. Okay, we're very close to the end. These are descriptive categories that any ordinary citizen can legitimately rely on to press a claim for democracy when one of its constitutive elements is deemed to be absent, ignored, or not fully enforced. The use of these categories is part of what can be called a process of democracy production, which is constantly at work in a state society. I mean, all these 8 categories are basically what drives people to claim a change or a satisfactory change in the conditions of democracy. And so there is a process of democracy production. That's why I said it's an unreachable horizon. You just try to reach the horizon of democracy, but never go to it. That's why it's better to think that there's a process of democracy production which is constantly at work in a state society. This Eden process is made visible, the Eden process is made visible at different points in time, and it's particularly blatant when civil disobedience or protest movements express themselves in the streets or on city squares. Oh, finished. This statement allows me to conclude the series of conferences I've been invited to give at RANEPA by expressing a conviction which derives from my practice of analytical sociology. Even if nobody knows what its final result should be, any state society on earth is irremediably engaged in a process of democracy production. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an exciting presentation, and dear colleagues, if you have any questions, please ask them.
Sorry, I'd like to speak in Russian. Профессор кафедры национальных федеративных отношений.
Подождите одну секундочку и включите, пожалуйста, микрофон. Включите микрофон, пожалуйста, кнопочку. Спасибо.